Hi, Lissa here. I wanted to talk with you today about core competency 7, evokes awareness. It's one of my favorite of the competencies because it is often the bulk of most coaching conversations. And so it's such a wonderful place to explore ways that we are in partnership and relationship with our clients. So a quick synopsis of the competency itself. The definition is facilitates client insight and learning by using tools and techniques such as powerful questioning, silence, metaphor, or analogy. For all of you who know me, you know my great love of metaphors. So I'm going to go into that in a moment. But there are 8 indicators along the markers that demonstrate, or examples that demonstrate this particular competency. Coach asks questions about the client, such as their current way of thinking, feeling, values, needs, wants, beliefs, or behaviors. So we're asking questions of the client around what's showing up for them right now. This may show up as us asking them when they use, when they share a situation, what's important about this situation for you might be an example of a question that invites the client to share how they're thinking, feeling, or their values around a situation. What would you like to have be different when you're thinking in the context of this conversation? And the client may come up with that. So those would be examples of that. The second one is coach asks questions to help client explore beyond the current thinking or feeling towards new or expanded ways of thinking or feeling about themselves, the who. So an example of this might be, as you hear yourself say that, what do you notice about yourself in this situation? Might be a way that we're exploring this with the client. We want to really invite the client to explore how they are showing up and how they want to show up, and maybe what's between how they're showing up and how they want to show up. The third indicator, coach asks questions to help the client explore beyond the client's current thinking or feeling towards new or expanded ways of thinking and feeling about the situation. These are questions that might invite the client to take a bird's eye view. If we were to take a bird's eye view of this situation and you look at the landscape in front of you, what are you noticing? This really brings us into things like metaphor and analogy. And I cannot stress enough how powerful it is when the client brings a metaphor forward that we ask about it. So for instance, I'm thinking of a situation in which the client was asked, what would you like to have? What would you like to give yourself that would be different than what you are giving yourself? And the client said, I'd like to give myself more compassion and grace. I'd like to give myself some wiggle room. That was such an opportunity for the coach to ask, and as you're giving yourself a little wiggle room, what would that be like for you? To give yourself this wiggle room. There's no way for the client to be led in a direction towards solving a problem at that point, because now they're making meaning around what they meant by wiggle room. What's the experience of giving grace and giving wiggle room? And I think that's really crucial. So that would be how we're exploring the what, but we're still in exploring the who as we do that. The fourth indicator is coach asks questions to help the client explore beyond current thinking, feeling, or behaving towards the outcome of their desires or their desired outcome. And this might be when we hear people talking about, like, I can only do it if I do it perfectly. So what does it even mean to do it perfectly? How does doing it perfectly keep you in a loop around not doing it? Or how does doing it perfectly get in the way of you taking action? Or it could just be any number of questions there, but I'm thinking about this idea of exploring what is this idea of perfection and how is it helping you and how is it hindering you as you move towards what you say you want. I know for myself, when I was writing my book and I was getting coaching, there were days where I just would look at this blank page and I didn't know what to do with the blank page. And one of the things that my coach would ask is, what is the story you're telling yourself right now? And I'd be like, it's the story of perfection. Like I have to say it perfectly. And what would be the first step in just saying it? And for a lot of writers, that becomes like getting it all out on the paper and doing the editing later, not editing in my mind as I'm writing. And so this again is this invitation to explore what's between where I am and where I want to be. The fifth indicator is client coach shares with no attachment, observations, intuitions, comments, thoughts, feelings, and invites the client's exploration through verbal or tonal invitation. This, I can't even stress this enough. There are so many times in a coaching conversation where what we end up doing is we end up making a statement. I've heard you say XYZ. The client is left with, yes, or no, I also added this. And so what we want to do is we want to trust our intuitive hits. We want to trust what it is that we're wanting to share, but we want to do it with a very open-handed manner. I'm not attached to being right about this. I'm not attached that I understand. I'm making the observation. I'm noticing an energetic shift that just happened as you were talking, but we want to then follow that up with a question. What are you noticing? I heard you use the language, this word, and I'm wondering, what does that word mean to you? We're asking them to make their own meaning after we share something. So this morning, actually, I was listening to a coaching conversation, and one of the things that as a choice point that I noticed for myself while the client was talking was this tension between fear and the desire to move forward in some way. And I had an image of magnets and the sense of sometimes magnets really pull together, and sometimes if they're flipped the other way, they push apart from each other. And it would be something like sharing, I'm having this experience of these magnets, but they're not wanting to be together. What does that mean to you in context to what you're talking about? So what we're doing is we're offering the observation that showed up for us, but we're not attached to what the client does with it. And we do want them to be the one to make the meaning about the value of this observation that we just made. The sixth one, coach asks clear, direct, primarily open-ended questions, one at a time, at a pace that allows for thinking, feeling, or reflection by the client. For me, this was the hardest one. I love to stack questions. So it took me really being intentional about slowing myself down and asking one question and letting it just sit there. The simpler and clearer the question is, the easier it is to just sit with it. And so it takes just practice of intentionality to really get clear and open-ended. Using language that is generally clear and concise, which is number 7. And then the 8th indicator is allows the client to do most of the talking. So when I'm doing a PCC assessment, I may notice that there's a 30-minute conversation. The coach has talked maybe 9 or 10 minutes. The client has talked about 20. That's an indicator that the coach is letting the client have more of the airspace than the coach themselves is taking up. So these are different these are the different elements of Evokes Awareness, core competency number 7. And honestly, I really feel like silence is the one that isn't necessarily mentioned specifically as a behavioral indicator, but there are places where the client is clearly thinking about something. You've asked a question and there's silence. Getting comfortable with that silence, allowing that space for the client to process the question, to process what's coming up as a result of the question, invites the client to have the autonomy, honestly, to be able to really gather their own thoughts. And I think as coaches, we can often stop that awareness from happening because if we're uncomfortable with the silence, we may rush to fill it with another question because we feel like the client has been quiet too long. I remember a coach asking a question of a client in a demonstration I was observing, and it was a really simple, powerful question that they asked, and the client was silent. And the coach just let that silence sit there for what felt like a really long time. It didn't feel uncomfortable, but it was a pretty long time. And then the coach asked, "What just happened in the silence?" And that is, again, this idea of asking questions that invite the client to that inward experience. What just happened there? So using silence can be incredibly powerful in the way that we support clients to have that inside out evoking of awareness for themselves. So I hope this was useful, and I'll see you on another video. If you have any questions, please reach out and ask them. I'd love to answer them if at all possible.